Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for coming here to the Hudson Institute for a joint event between Hudson and U.S.-Europe Alliance. And welcome to our guests viewing online. This event is a very timely one, titled Foreshocks in the Black Sea and Western Balkans, Repercussions of the Russia-Ukraine War. It's a great pleasure that Richard reached out to me and not asked me this year just to speak at the U.S.-Europe Alliance event that he holds annually, but to co-host it with him here at Hudson. And Richard Kramer, the president of U.S.-Europe Alliance, has done a lot to bring attention to these two regions, the Western Balkans and the Black Sea, to focus here in Washington, D.C. Excuse me. At a time when both of these regions needed more attention. Well, right now, the Black Sea, of course, is getting a lot of attention, and rightfully so, especially after Russia's large-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. But the Western Balkans still doesn't get the level of attention and focus it needs and deserves here in Washington, D.C. So we hope that today will play a role in helping that discussion. So I just wanted to give quick welcoming remarks, and I will turn it over to my colleague and friend, Richard Kramer. Thank you.
Thank you, Luke. Good morning. I'm Richard Kramer, president of the U.S.-Europe Alliance. The U.S.-Europe Alliance mission is to mobilize Americans to advocate for the enduring U.S.-Europe partnership, and we do so primarily by getting outside of Washington, D.C., and talking to Americans about the benefits that they receive from our partnership with democratic Europe, not just militarily and politically, but certainly economically, so that they have an understanding about how this relationship benefits them and their families. In the 5 years of our existence, we've had roughly 30 events, both in Washington, but largely throughout the United States, as well as publishing a number of articles, papers, and media appearances in which we participated, all in support of a strong transatlantic partnership. The February 2022 invasion, full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, unleashed at what I would call an unprecedented level of partnership and cooperation at the transatlantic level. We saw engagement from Brussels, from many European capitals, and from Washington that heretofore had been unseen. There was a clarity of purpose that came forward, and with that, many of us who desire that Ukraine be free and prosperous and sovereign felt a great degree of hope in the direction that things were going. So now we're 3 years into the war, and we're faced with a waning interest in a lot of sectors, both in Europe as well as in the United States. Of course, there's a significant level of fatigue amongst Ukrainians, amongst Europeans, amongst Americans. Exacerbating this, or potentially making the situation all the worse, has been the resurgence of far-right political parties and governments throughout Europe. We might actually have Marie Le Pen as president of France. We have Prime Minister of Slovakia, Robert Fico, who has regularly and outrightly rejected continued support for Ukraine, and in my estimate, often mimicking the individual that I would say is the greatest menace within the EU and NATO bloc to our common transatlantic security, that being Prime Minister Viktor Orban of Hungary, whose government has essentially turned Hungary into a Chinese and Russian proxy state. Sadly, we're experiencing some of this waning, if you will, here in Washington, as we all well know. It's been most unfortunate to see the level of engagement from those that want to detract from our continued support of Ukraine, particularly those on the Hill that sought to delay the passage of an aid package that was desperately needed by Ukraine Defense Forces. And as a consequence, I would argue that there have been hundreds, if not more, needless deaths in Ukraine of both soldiers and civilians because of these delays. As short-sighted as they are, as willfully ignorant as they may be, what surprises me the most is the lack of understanding or recognition of what the consequences of a Russian victory would be. First off, the historically expansionist Russia will push the envelope into neighboring EU and NATO member states. This could in turn weaken the resolve of NATO and compromise its integrity, which would be detrimental to our own national security interests. There will be economic implications for the United States that will be as great, if not greater, than the political ramifications, as negative as they may be. I'd like to give a couple numbers so that we can contextualize the extent of this potential economic impact. In 2022, U.S. exports to the EU reached $3.4 trillion, up 28.8% from the previous year. In turn, the European Union and member states have, through foreign direct investment, put $1.4 trillion in the U.S. economy, up 4% from 2021. Finally, and perhaps most important number for me, is that the EU and US between them employ 9 million citizens directly of our states in the United States, and 16 million are employed indirectly. In the event of a Russian victory, we're going to see the disruption of markets, we're going to see supply chains that are going to be running amok, and we're also going to see an overall downturn in an economy in Europe, which right now is in a precarious position. Specifically to the panels that we're going to address today, I'm especially worried about the Western Balkans and the Black Sea region. My greatest fear in the Western Balkans is that with a Russian victory, ultranationalists throughout that region will be empowered, and particularly an unrepentant Serb nation that, through means of violence, may seek to realize the twistedness of that manifesto in countries like Bosnia and Kosovo. And as for the Black Sea region, well, I don't think we can't say it's going to quite return to the Russian lake it once was, but they will certainly have all the greater influence, and that will directly impact, amongst other things, the energy that transits both under the Black Sea and throughout that region. That's what's at stake. Having shared that, I'm going to introduce our moderators for our panels and our keynote speaker today. So moderating the Black Sea panel will be Daniel Kochis. He is a senior fellow in the Center on Europe and Eurasia here at Hudson Institute, where he specializes in transatlantic security issues and regularly publishes on United States policy in Europe, NATO, Baltic, and Nordic dimensions of collective defense. Prior to joining Hudson, Daniel spent 11 years at Heritage Foundation's Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. Reverberate, who's been instrumental in working with USA and making sure this event is kicking off to a great success, will be moderating the Western Balkans panel. Rev is Vice President of the U.S.-Europe Alliance, and he has served as the President of the Emerging Democracies Institute in Washington, D.C., and was President of Civic Alliance in Sarajevo. He has served as Minister of Energy, Industry, and Mining in the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and has served as an advisor in over a dozen countries to political parties, private foundations, and development agencies, including USAID, the European Commission, the United Nations Development Program, DFID, the UK Department for International Development, GIZ, the German Agency for International Cooperation, and our own National Democratic Institutes and International Republican Institutes. And our keynote remarks will be given by, amongst other things, an advisory council member who has helped USEA a great deal since we launched 5 years ago. That is Dalibor Rohac. Dalibor is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies European political and economic trends, specifically Central and Eastern Europe, the European Union, and the Eurozone, US-EU relations, and the post-communist transitions and backsliding countries in the former Soviet bloc. He is concurrently a research associate at the Wilfrid Martin Center for European Studies in Brussels and a fellow at the Anglo-American University in Prague. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dalibor.
Rich, thank you so much, and thank you, Luke and Hudson, for hosting us, and thank you all for organizing this incredibly timely conference, as Luke put it. I think it was timely at the time when the invites went out last week or week before then, but I think it's even more timely having seen, as all of us have, the images from Tbilisi over the weekend. I was a little incredulous, I have to say, when I was asked to deliver a keynote at the conference on Western Balkans and the Black Sea region, because I'm far from being an expert on either of those two. As I joked earlier in this room, a failed economic historian, a Czechoslovak, living in Washington, working mostly on Central and Eastern Europe. So I was thinking really hard about how best I can contribute, and I concluded the best I could do was to kind of zoom out a little bit and put developments in both of these regions into a broader context. And that context, in my mind, is one of rising uncertainty particularly about the role that the United States and the collective West are going to
play in the coming years. If you paid even a superficial attention to news headlines over the recent years, you'll know that the world is not getting any stable. And it's tempting to think of the stories such as the war in Ukraine, the war in Gaza, Houthi piracy in the Red Sea, or Chinese behavior in South China Sea as isolated stories that don't really have much in common. But to me, they really are just one story. It's a story of a fraying rules-based order, if you will. And I know there'll be people who will say that there has never been such a thing as a rules-based order, that it's all an illusion. But the reality is that things are happening today and are happening at a scale that would have been unimaginable 15 years ago. And things that we sort of took for granted not very long ago are now being shattered on a daily basis. And I have to say that in response to this, the collective West, the United States and its allies, are more often than not lethargic. And I know that defense spending has gone up in Europe. I know that the United States and its European allies have provided unprecedented amounts of assistance to Ukraine. I know there have been verbal expressions of support to those who now protest the Russian foreign agents law in Georgia. But I don't have the sense that Washington, Brussels, Westminster have the initiative. More often than not, I suspect that there are power voids that have been created that are making things dangerous, and that when the West does act, it is always in response to bad actors who have sort of taken the initiative. And my suspicion also is that for some time, both the Western Balkans and the Black Sea region have been caught in the middle of one such power void, if you will. And the story is not that different from the story of Ukraine, to be frank. Now, the term void is not an exactly appropriate term to describe what's going on, because clearly both regions have felt the gravitational pull of the West quite strongly. I mean, just talk to Georgians and look at how brave they are and what they've been doing recently. And look at people across the Western Balkans who want the same things that people in Western Europe already have: rule of law, Western European standards of living, access to Western markets, etc., etc. So there is this gravitational pull, which is just strong enough to divert these countries from the previous orbits, to continue with this metaphor. But it's not quite strong enough to land them safely in the collective West, the way my home country of Slovakia landed safely within the collective West back in 2004, or the Baltic states, or Romania and Bulgaria. And to some extent, that's also the story of Ukraine, if you will. So early next year, it will have been 20 years since the original Orange Revolution, 2004-2005. The country, following it, sought unsuccessfully NATO membership or path to NATO membership in 2008. Then it sought in 2013-14 with extraordinarily broad popular support closer ties with the EU. Now it's getting those closer ties. It's in the process of negotiating its accession, thanks to the Revolution of Dignity and the events that followed. But that sort of movement away from Russia's sphere of influence prompted Russian response, to which the collective West has not responded with sufficient force. So the collective West, the United States and its allies, have not protected Ukraine against Russian aggression. Instead of NATO membership, Ukrainians had to rely on the Budapest Memorandum. Then they got the Minsk agreements, adding insult to injury. And I don't know what your expectations for this year's NATO summit are, but I'm not entirely convinced that we'll see a much clearer path towards NATO membership. And clearly, governments across Western Balkans and the Black Sea region have been watching these developments closely, and it has informed and shaped their own approaches, which have very often consisted of triangulating in various ways within the EU and the West on the one hand, and Moscow, and in some cases China. So clearly, Western Balkans may not fear a Russian invasion, but the norm has been a sort of a sort of two-faced, cynical politics that has sought to extract concessions from everybody, and all of that has been encouraged along the way by the EU's own fecklessness, the proliferation of special envoys and EU funds with little accountability. Some of that seems to be changing, but again, it's not the sort of the different world that was promised to us the days of the full scale in the early days of the full scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, where the expectation was that this was finally the moment when the West was getting its act together. I mean, and it's a similar story in places like Georgia, where nominally the political class is committed towards forging deeper ties with the EU, but they've also saying and doing it, without trying not to alienate Moscow, and clearly this is not to the satisfaction of Georgia. And same story, I would argue, in places like Armenia. And Moldova is probably the sort of success story we could sort of point out to, where there is real momentum behind moving to the West, but the question is whether it can be sustained. And I think in all of these cases, the most important condition for success is one of an environment of security. I mean, the EU membership, which has been great for many countries, including my own, can't do its magic without a secure geopolitical environment. There was no question, I think, in the early notice of the Central Eastern European countries joining the EU without being previously members of NATO. And none of these countries that I mentioned earlier, whether it's Georgia, Armenia, Moldova, etc., I don't think stand much chance of joining successfully the collective West unless their security challenges are resolved. And I don't think their security challenges are going to be resolved unless at least the following three conditions are met. A, unless Ukraine wins the war, and they're not going to be resolved without the United States. And they're not going to be resolved, thirdly, without a real shift in policy, both here and in Europe. Clearly, a defeated, demoralized, dismembered Ukraine and an emboldened Russia will give the Kremlin the opportunities and sort of tools to police its own neighborhood, and to do so quite harshly. And I think that is the expectation of people living in these so-called borderlands. The United States has a role to play. I mean, Europeans are not in a position to give away credible security guarantees. The US is the only game in town, whether we like it or not. We want the Europeans to do more. They are doing more, but the idea that the EU or Europeans collectively on their own, without Washington, could somehow protect Georgia, Armenia, Western Balkans, etc., against Russian influence or Chinese influence is just fanciful. And thirdly, the biggest question, I think, which is sort of looming over this conference, is whether Washington can do this and whether Washington is willing to do this. And to me, really the sort of call to action is that the United States needs to become a serious country again. I think we need leadership that will explain the importance of not just Ukraine, but of these broader regions between the West and Russia and China, and explain the importance of these places to the American people. And that might mean that things in these places have to get far worse before they get any better, far worse before anybody springs to action. And my hope, including for the sake of the brave people of Georgia, is that it won't have to come to that, but I'm not entirely sure. So on that certainly not optimistic note, I'll stop droning on and give way to the first panel. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dalibor, for those terrific framing remarks, and thank you to all of you being with us today at Hudson Institute, both in person and online. We're in for a real treat today at the Black Sea panel. We have Dr. Yulia Zhozha, who's a senior fellow and director of the Middle East Institute's Black Sea program. She teaches European security as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University and GW University here in town. Her research and teachings focus primarily on European and Black Sea security. Prior to this, you served as an advisor to the Romanian president and as deputy project manager at NATO ACT in Norfolk, Virginia. She has worked with the Romanian delegation to the UN, the European Parliament, and the Romanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. You're also a visiting scholar at the Center for Military History and Social Sciences of the German Armed Forces in Potsdam, Berlin, and a postdoctoral fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute at Johns Hopkins SAIS.
And you did not need to read all of that, but thank you.
Well, I wanted to give you a proper send-off here to start the discussion. We're also very fortunate to be joined here in Washington by Dr. Elena Nishik, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the European Politics Research Group at ETH Zurich. You studied the EU's decision to grant Ukraine an EU candidate country status in your doctoral work. You also defended your thesis in politics at the University of Manchester in April of 2022. You have a bachelor's degree in international economics from Kyiv National Economic University, as well as a master's degree in economics. And then finally, we're very fortunate to be joined virtually, I can see, by Georgi Klevdiliani, who is the founder and director general of the Gemziri platform. He's also a leader in Georgian civil society, playing an active role in the ongoing protests in Tbilisi. So I think we have a terrific panel for everyone. And I think that we're going to start with my left here. If you would begin your opening comments, we can start right there. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much. First of all, big thank you to Richard for putting this together. Whether the Black Sea or the Balkans are in the focus or not, he hangs on and focuses on that and focuses all of us on it. So it's fantastic that this is taking place. And of course, big thanks to Luke and Hudson for hosting this and giving us a platform to, as Dalibor said, my esteemed co-host on the podcast Eastern Front, drone on about the importance of the region and how we should be focusing, particularly here in Washington, D.C., more on this. I promised in coordinating with Richard today, I promised I'll give a bit of a general overview of the impact of the war on the region to the extent that I can in a few minutes, and focus a little bit on the two EU countries, Romania and Bulgaria, in terms of how they have adjusted and what they are bringing or not bringing to the table in terms of contributions in the context of this regional security environment that we're dealing with since the full-scale invasion in 2022. And I'll try to make 3 points, essentially how we got to where we are, that would be the second point, and then a little bit of an outlook into where I think we might be heading to, and I'll look forward to hearing then more specifically and more in depth on Ukraine and of course on Georgia that are the highlights, of course, in this context. So it goes without saying that now, and Luke mentioned this earlier, that now the Black Sea is recognized as one of the hotspots in terms of the security environment, including here in Washington, D.C., including in Brussels. That wasn't the case until the full-scale invasion, and a lot of mistakes that we've made collectively in the West and on the eastern flank have led to the situation that we're in today. And I don't have a lot of time to go into all the mistakes that we already know, but it's important, I think, to acknowledge that the shortcomings that we're now demonstrating when it comes to supporting Ukraine and helping set Ukraine up for success and enabling victory are something that we need to acknowledge to be able to avoid making continuous mistakes in the months and years to come. If we're looking at how we got here and how big of a problem this is, I recall about a month ago, a few days before the supplemental was finally approved, that we had been waiting for supplemental for Ukraine since November last year. The Prime Minister of Japan, one of the most important strategic allies of the United States, came to town, talked to Congress, and actually essentially begged for the United States to approve aid for Ukraine. This is how important this is, that even Japan realizes that if we're not enabling Ukraine, the future of a rules-based order led by the United States is really at stake, whether we're talking about the Euro-Atlantic space or the Indo-Pacific space. And if we're looking at what the Europeans have been doing, Dalibor has mentioned that already, and I think a little bit Luke as well. It goes without saying that they have been pulling their weight to the extent that has been possible, to an unprecedented extent compared to what we have seen before 2022. But we know that it hasn't been enough, either in terms of quantity, the number of euros or weapons or ammunition for Ukraine, support for Ukraine, humanitarian and not only, but also in terms of quality of the support that is extended. So I won't be going into the numbers that I think a lot of us are familiar with, but I'll say that as we're zooming into the region and trying to assess how countries have been faring over the last few years, I'd say one of the benchmarks is, in terms of the mistakes, of course, the Budapest Memorandum and the consequences that we're drawing at the level of Ukraine, but also region-wise because of that. I would also argue that another turning point has been 2008, and not just the fact that we haven't responded in terms of the collective West to what has happened in Georgia, but that in 2010, when we're talking about NATO, we named Russia a partner in the last strategic concept. How can this even be now that we're looking back at it? And so the adaptation, the strategic adaptation hasn't been sufficient. And then we add to it that on the European side, there's been Western European side, as the countries in Central and Eastern Europe were joining the European Union, were insisting that the threat assessment should be a postmodern one, that we cannot conceive of traditional wars being fought on the European continent, and that we should essentially be demilitarizing. And on the US side, that we shouldn't be focusing on territorial defense anymore. All of these countries have been important on both EU and NATO side, and Georgia and Ukraine on the other hand, in supporting the United States in Afghanistan, supporting them in Iraq. So territorial defense and conventional warfare and all the capabilities that we had to invest in were gone. Expeditionary warfare was on the table, and that of course is added to the costs that we're now incurring again at the regional level. And if we're looking at how the countries have been adapting, I'd say 2014 has been the turning point for some, but not for all of them. For Ukraine, it certainly has, forced by circumstances. For Romania, it has as well, to a slower extent, but nevertheless, Romania has felt sort of confirmed in the statements that it was making prior to 2014, independent of government or president. We have told you so. We should focus more on the Black Sea. And when we're looking at countries such as Moldova, such as Bulgaria, Turkey is a complicated animal, then we will see that adaptation after 2014 hasn't been enough. There hasn't been enough adaptation in the first place, and neither has it been at the level of NATO or the European Union, because we had the tailored forward presence in NATO, which meant no troops and no tripwires and no support, no qualitative support in the region of the Black Sea, unlike in the Baltic Sea, where we know there was a little bit more, but arguably also not close to enough. And then we're moving on to until 2022. And as we're looking into the region, there's one more element apropos the reorientation that some countries in the region have been going through, and that's 2016, the preparation of the summit in Warsaw, when Romania put on the table as a proposal a NATO Black Sea fleet. Wouldn't that have been helpful in 2022? But it was Bulgaria that changed its mind, most likely due to Russian pressure. And we've learned later rumors, WikiLeaks, that unsurprisingly Turkey was opposing, as a NATO member state, that proposal as well. So here we are then, where we're getting to in 2022. Some adaptation after 2014 at the region and when it comes to NATO and EU, but clearly not sufficient. So where are we now? That gets us to today. And if we're looking at Ukraine, I would call it, and we'll hear more in a minute from my Ukrainian counterpart, it's certainly enhanced readiness. And I wish we would take that more seriously. I'll just say that because my job here is not to talk about Ukraine, but I'll say this because we're looking at the upcoming summit of NATO here in Washington, D.C., that I wish we would take more into account strategically the fact that Ukraine has now the most trained, the most ready military that we could hope for in NATO. What kind of a contribution would that be to NATO readiness, instead of pushing Ukraine off the table and arguing, like we've heard before with Central and Eastern European countries, oh, they're not ready to join yet. They have so much to do. When we're looking at an alliance, a military alliance such as NATO, I wish we would take more into account strategic calculations rather than stereotypes. And if we're looking at the other countries, Romania and Bulgaria particularly, I'll say a very brief word about Turkey as well. In the case of Romania, I mentioned it's sort of reconfirmed assessments. And Romania has been doing a lot to get its military readiness. It is in major acquisition programs for defense. If we're looking at a singular unilateral level, there's always room for improvement, always room for more investment. But overall, the assessment compared to other countries in the region, I'd say is positive. At least on paper, Romania is now increasing to 2.5%. We should take our notes from other countries in the region and, of course, increase it to more than that. 2.5, of course, should also be only a standard. And if we're looking at aid for Ukraine, because we cannot decouple the things, it's been important too for flow of refugees, but also flow of military increasingly military support and military and logistical maintenance. In this instance, Romania has been, again, increasingly important, particularly if we're looking at the flow of exports, grain, after Russia canceled the grain deal in 2023. And the grain corridor came in with the help of Romania and Bulgaria, as Ukraine is sort of, ships coming out of Ukraine are hugging the territorial lines to be able to stay safe from Russian attacks. And of course, the relationship has been reciprocal because both Bulgaria and Romania, and to some extent Turkey, have been benefiting from this unbelievable fact that a country without a navy has managed to significantly reduce the Russian Black Sea Fleet. And that this also leads to benefits, including for NATO, when we're looking at freedom of navigation, which is one of the 4 priorities of the US Black Sea strategy. And if we're looking at Bulgaria, the strategic shift has been somewhere between 90 and 180 degrees, depending on who you talk to in Sofia. But the shift has been real, and we know now, including from later on publications, that Bulgaria has been essential for energy security in the region with the help of the United States, and I'm thinking LNG from Alexandroupolis and beyond. We know that Bulgaria has been essential in the early days when it came in the war when it comes to ammunition and ammunition production of Soviet style, and continues to be so. And so we also see at the unilateral level in Bulgaria a shift and more of a focus on increasing readiness. And then we have regional cooperation that is also unprecedented. I'll name you a couple of examples and I'll move on to my last point. And that is, for instance, we have, goes under the radar, a Romanian-Bulgarian strategic partnership signed in a few months into the full-scale invasion. They did not have one before the full-scale invasion. It's very much focused on Ukraine and Moldova, and it's probably the most comprehensive and detailed strategic partnership that exists between countries in the region. That's also another benefit of how countries have increased their cooperation, sort of pushed by Russia. And then we have, for the first time, a regional initiative that excludes Russia in the Black Sea, and that includes Turkey, Bulgaria, and Romania for demining in the Black Sea. We still are in a spot in which Turkey continues its long-term policy of excluding the West or Western access to the Black Sea, but I'm hoping this changes too over time as Turkey must realize how the balance of power has shifted due to Russia. I'll say one last thing here on Turkey, and we can talk about it more in questions, and that is that Turkey, without moving a finger, has managed to change that balance of power because it has enabled the West to send the weapons to Ukraine to shift the naval balance of power in the Black Sea, while maintaining at the same time its dependencies and amplifying them when it comes to energy, and not only with Russia. So Turkey is playing an ever-increasing role in the region. We need Turkey on board going forward into more deterrence and more NATO support in the region. And then where are we heading? I'm afraid here I can't end on a positive note neither, because there isn't sufficient. We have to acknowledge that the aid is unprecedented. The level of cooperation in the region is unprecedented, forced by circumstances. But this brings me back to my assessment, unfortunately, at the beginning of the year, and that is that we have the significant risk which we see in front of our eyes. In February, we saw this with Avdiivka, and now increasingly that the front lines could, despite the aid that we're providing, because it is insufficient qualitatively and quantitatively, for the front lines to move. And then we have consequences that are economic, that Richard described, ample, but we also have to think at the EU and NATO level about levels of refugees that we should be looking ahead in terms of risks, so economic, social costs, and of course the fact that with a Russian victory and a Ukrainian defeat, we cannot conceive of Western provided stable security in the Black Sea region. Thank you, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much for those comments. After 2014, there's always so many specifics in the Baltic region about numbers of troops there and press releases, and I always got this sense that it was like grasping at air in terms of what was tailored for presence and who was there, and I always got the sense that NATO wasn't quite sure how engaged it wanted to be in the Black Sea region, but now this is the sort of keystone for Europe's future and forcing them to be engaged. So moving east, we'll hand it over to you for some opening thoughts, please.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Richard, for invitation. My first time speaking in Washington. I'm very eager to involve the discussion, to hear what is a perception about this war in the US. We'll be happy then to answer your questions and to discuss. And my colleague did not want to speak about mistakes. I will speak about mistakes because that's also one of the main topics of my book, which you can see here. It was about EU-Ukraine-Russia relations in the first year of the war, 2014-15, and also compared a bit with the current Russian invasion. And I found a lot of misperceptions in these relations. And in this presentation today, I will discuss Western misperceptions about Russia. And maybe some of these points are obvious, but again and again, these mistakes are repeated by policymakers in Brussels and also here. So I would like to remind these obvious points once again. So first of all, my first point is when international law is broken, it's broken. So we had Georgia, we had Crimea, and everybody was thinking in Europe and in US that, okay, maybe it's a little bit, maybe it's not the whole breakage of international law, maybe Russia will stop with this. But no, Russia did not stop, and Russia went further because it saw that the West is weak, the West did not respond properly. And now, with my recent research, I just did the interviews in Brussels, and everybody is already saying, yeah, maybe we made a mistake, maybe we had to react differently. And now Eastern European countries are saying, yeah, but we told you, And so we should accept when there is some tiny breakage of international law, it's already broken, okay? Then another point, which is, might also be obvious, but am I not too loud?
No, that's good.
Listen to Putin, take him seriously. So Putin told everything before what he's going to do. There was Munich speech in 2007 where he said that he doesn't see Ukraine as an independent country. When Ukraine wants to join NATO, then it would join without Donbass and Crimea. Then before 2022, we had Putin's essay in summer 2021, where he was also very open how he sees history between Ukraine and Russia, and he did not see Ukraine as a dependent state again. And everybody was thinking, no, he cannot be serious. No, it's just words. But he was serious. So when you hear Putin telling something, take him seriously. And another point, not to underestimate Russia. So in Ukraine, okay, there is a war between Ukraine and Russia, and you have some kind of this propaganda to keep the spirit. But still, sometimes you read that Russian army is so weak, there are alcoholics, they're not able to do anything. Or we had some Ukrainian politician telling, in 2-3 weeks it's over, or Russian missiles are finished in 2-3 weeks. And this is a big mistake to underestimate your enemy. So Russia is not that strong, but Russia is not that weak. So you need to take Russia seriously, be realistic. Another point, Russia cannot be trusted to follow the signed agreement, the signed by it international agreements. We had the Budapest Memorandum, yes, we had the agreements of friendship with Ukraine and many other agreements. And that's an issue now when we discuss possibilities of peace. Ukrainians cannot trust Russia already because Russia broke international agreements so many times. And also, Russia cannot be a reliable trade partner. Even before annexation of Crimea, Russia organized trade wars, which impacted also gas wars and trade wars, yes, which impacted also European Union. Regarding Black Sea region, there was grain deal, and Russia, during function of this agreement, Russia was attacking Ukrainian grain terminals. Mm-hmm. So Russia cannot be trusted to follow international agreements. But at the same time, interesting point that Russia is not rejecting international law. So that's also a mistake to say that Russia is outside international law. Okay, now with this invasion, it's already more obvious. But before, for instance, in Crimea and in Donbass, it was very interesting. Russia is not rejecting international law. It's playing with it. It offers its own interpretation of international law. And it uses international law and some of its issues and Western mistakes with international law. It uses it against the West. And it's happening also now. Also in the West, you would say, yeah, now everything is obvious. But look at UN voting. Why so many countries in Asia, in Africa still vote pro-Russian? And Ukrainian politicians are saying that this, before the voting, when they approach these countries, Russia was already talking to these countries. And Russia is using legal arguments to persuade these countries to vote not for Ukraine, but vote for Russia. So when it's obvious for us in the West how we perceive international law, Russia might have different perceptions. It uses legal arguments in its favor, and then we have it that some countries are buying it, Russian interpretation of international law. And another point that Russia will be there. So in Ukraine there are some dreams, there may be some ocean, Russia will disappear. So Russia will stay there, and there should be policy to do something with Russia, because Russia will be Ukraine's neighbor, it will be neighbor of European Union. Okay, for US, Russia is far, but Russia is still there, Russia will exist. We need to have strategy to deal with it, we need to accept, to understand how better to deal with it, because Russia is the biggest country in the world, it's a threat, it is there. My another point is peace possible. I will start with Ukrainian public opinion. So currently, the vast majority of Ukrainians are against any territorial concessions and are for NATO membership. So all these talks that Ukraine might give up some territory or NATO membership, if peace is not accepted in Ukraine, then it will not be viable. So for instance, in 2022 and from 2022 and up until this December 2023, around 80–90% of Ukrainians, between 80 and 90% of Ukrainians rejected any territorial concessions, even with long-lasting war and other threats. Interestingly, this figure dropped only in December last year. So we saw this lack of successes in Ukraine's counteroffensive in summer, and now it's already 74% of Ukrainians who are against any territorial concessions. But still this number is huge. Still the vast majority of Ukrainians are against any territorial concessions, that's including Crimea as well. In May 2023, support for NATO membership was 89%. It was growing from 70% from April 2022, and we have a little bit of a drop. In February this year, it was 77%. So it's still the vast majority of Ukrainians want NATO or don't want to give this up. And when Russia started its shelling of Ukrainian cities of civilians in autumn 2022, 86% of Ukrainians supported fighting, continuing fighting, even with continued shelling of Ukrainian cities. Interesting number, in March 2023, 64% of Ukrainians would support liberation of all territories, even without Western support. So you know that it's not realistic for Ukraine to continue fighting to free territories without Western support, with total no support, but the majority of Ukrainians are ready to do this and to fight to liberate the whole territory of Ukraine. In February this year, 89% of Ukrainians generally believed in victory. So 90% of Ukrainians believed in victory now, in February 2024. And 60% of them are definitely convinced in victory. Again, in February 2024, 73% of Ukrainians were ready to endure the war as long as necessary. And this figure was not changing during the whole war. So 70% of Ukrainians are ready to suffer and to fight as long as it takes. And the last interesting statistic about Ukraine, that the question was asked if Ukraine can choose to accomplish one task, what it would be, what would be the most important. First task, 39%, full-scale war and borders of 1991. Then NATO membership, 23%. 19% freeze the war and save lives, and 11% membership in European Union. And now regarding Russia, that also relates to take Russia seriously, a bit sad points. So first of all, Russia is still strong. Russia still has many resources, natural, human, and industrial, military. And sanctions were good, of course. Ukrainians were asking for sanctions. It's good that the EU and the US applied sanctions against Russia, but unfortunately, Russia managed to reorient its economy, and the economy is not collapsing. It's also, you hear in 2-3 weeks there will be collapse of economy. No, it's not true. Russian economy is doing pretty well. It managed to orient the economy. It has partners with Iran, China, India, African states. So when you hear maybe among policymakers or in scientific communities, the world is all united to support Ukraine, that's not true. The world is divided. And these Russian partners, China, India, Iran, maybe they're not very much trusted partners and they love to have friendship with Russia, but they're using each other and Russia manages to survive because of this. And for instance, Iran is a huge contributor to military might of Russia. Then situation in Russia, around 80% of people support Putin, support the war. They profit from it. For people from Russian East, if they go to the front line and they fight for 2 months, they can go back and they can buy a flat. They like it. Their wives, if they die, they get compensation. Military plants are working and they provide jobs and people are more or less happy. Another point, there is no civil society in Russia. So sometimes when I say it, I always get a question, yeah, but this one person there just went out and, and one person, they wrote a post on Facebook. And I'm not telling there are no individual people in Russia protesting, but in general, we can say there is no civil society. We saw it, that there were no protests when Navalny was killed, there were no big protests when the war was, when mobilization in Russia, whatever, there was tiny protests. And for people who study Russian civil society and study different organizations, they say that even some tiny civil society initiatives like building a park or whatever, everything was closed now with the war. There is totally no civil society now. And coming from this, also, there is no realistic better leader. So some people have this dream that when Putin disappears and Russia is democratic and nice and everything. There is no such person, so there is no leader, there is no any party, anything that can compete with Putin. It's also possible that if Putin disappears, someone worse can come to power. There is also opinion that the next person will be a child of someone of Putin's circle. And so these hopes for better leadership are also not true. So in the end, is peace possible? So Ukraine cannot give up. Why? Because Ukrainians lost too much. They cannot surrender now. You saw the statistics. Ukrainians want to fight until liberation of the whole country. Ukrainians do not trust Russia, and I already explained why. If Ukrainian leaders decide, or forced by the West, to surrender to Russia and to give up some parts of territories or NATO membership, then there may be protests, then leaders may be forced out of power, there may be insurgency, so it's not very viable possibility as well. Russia cannot give up as well. Putin cannot provide any victories at home, any social economic benefits, so he needs these big victories abroad. He needs to have a foreign threat. If he gives up, then it will be the end of his rule. He cannot lose Ukraine, so Russia is not power without Ukraine. All these Russian integration organizations, everything has no sense without Ukraine. Russia cannot lose control over Ukraine. And Russia cannot allow democratic, successful Ukraine because it's, again, a threat to Putin's power. If Russians see, okay, Ukraine, our brothers, they have democracy and good life, yeah, probably, maybe we can try to do it in Russia. So at the moment, it's also pessimistic. No one can give up, and the war is going on. And let's discuss it further. Yeah, questions. Thank you.
Thank you for those terrific remarks, Elena. And now from Dower to Dower, we're going to go to Georgia. And Georgi, I think the floor is yours if you're able to hear us.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Good morning, dear friends and colleagues. It's a pleasure to be with you on this very interesting panel, and thank you again for your remarks and speeches. First of all, I'd like to update you on the current situation in Georgia. After the whole night of the protest, the Russian law was passed in the third reading by the legal committee today in the morning, and they are going to pass the law in the tomorrow's session, which will be followed by the presidential veto, and again the ruling party plans to overcome it. So in the light of this, as you know, we are having unprecedented massive protests in Georgia for more than months already. We are gathering in the major avenue in Gamziri in front of the parliament to protest the Russian law, which is quite hardly responded to by the government. As you know, many things have dramatically changed here in Georgia very soon. The police forces are beating people just like in Russia and Belarus. They call even the families to scare them and prevent them from attending the demonstrations. So we're just watching how autocracy is establishing in our country. And this is only the beginning if we don't stop it now. And imagine all this process are under the label of the concept of, under the concept of transparency. Ruling party propaganda tries to label the process and label the bill as a bill for transparency. So to make money the civil sector is spending transparent. But the thing is that it is already quite transparent, and Georgian government can access detailed financial documents sent to the Treasury Department. And still, if they wanted to make all these documents and information public, they could just make small amendments in the grant law instead of proposing the bill which labels the whole civil sector as an agent of foreign influence. So to go back to the reality, this is the Russian soft power. This law is Russian soft power, which will be followed by the hard power as well. The law has two dimensions. First, it has symbolic meaning at the international stage for the countries in our region to mark itself in the zone of Russian influence. And secondly, when it's adapted, next steps are coming, which put social and political life on a Russian track. That includes repressing civil society, media, all the formal or informal independent groups working in various social issues, as well as political opposition, of course. It's labeling them all as an agents of foreign influence and oppress them as hard as possible. And actually, the next steps are already announced. In his latest speech, oligarch Bizina Ivanishvili announced that after the election, and by the way, we have election on 26th of October, he plans to punish government of 2004 to 2012 as a regime of foreign agents, which was manipulated by so-called global war party to provoke Russia in 2008. And ironically, this is told by the guy, I mean Ivanishvili, who years ago was saying that he was a major donor of newly elected government after the Rose Revolution, and he was using Soros Foundation to indirectly finance Saakashvili's government in order to not make Russians know it and avoid getting them angry about it. So we are in a process where government really wants to fully finalize its authoritarian ruling and make people too tired to fight in the upcoming election, which they want to falsify, of course, and get the constitutional majority. This is also proclaimed that they are trying to get the constitutional majority, and most probably the next step will be to take out from our constitution the country's NATO aspiration. So these are the upcoming plans, which are already quite loudly proclaimed. And to analyze the reality from a bit bigger perspective, we are watching Russia's growth in the region. So she made Kyrgyzstan in her zone of influence via exactly the same law. And via Kyrgyzstan, she told other Central Asian countries that Russia is still power which influenced the whole region. Now it tries Georgia to make clear part of its zone of influence, and if we, freedom-loving Georgians, lose this fight, this will be a clear message to our neighboring countries as well. So if we lose, Armenia is lost as well. Furthermore, Russia tries to make mess up in Balkans and provoke the conflict there. You're just going to discuss the issue in the next panel. And in this very difficult context, internal or external, we are fighting great fights. This is unbelievable what is going on every day in Tbilisi. But as everybody understands, our adversary is not only the Georgian government, which would be easier to deal with, right? But our adversary is Putin, who wants big changes in the region. And unfortunately, our Western allies are busy with their elections. However, we know that today there is a U.S. delegation visiting Georgia. Also, Jim O'Brien is here, and we hope that there will be a breakthrough. But as I said, any kind of appeasement will be counterproductive and will play in GD's favor. More than 200,000 people on the streets are asking to remove the bill and get back on the Western track. Everybody has to understand in the West that no soft power is working with Georgian dream anymore. The only way to prevent Georgia from becoming another Belarus is through the hard power from the Western allies. GD has to know that they are going to be heavily sanctioned if they do not step back. Otherwise, we are just losing the country, and you are just losing the ally in the region. This is a very tragic moment and turning point for Georgia. I still have the hopes, but reality is very tough. So this was a short kind of presentation, and I'm basically open for your questions. And again, thank you very much for inviting me in this on this very interesting panel.
Thank you. Thank you for those comments today, and thank you for being here. One of the interesting aspects of the Black Sea is that the bottom layer basically has no oxygen, so if something sinks, it essentially doesn't break down. And I get the sense that Russia is essentially trying to starve the region of oxygen, economic oxygen, civil society in the region of oxygen. And so the challenge is really how to infuse those lifebloods back into the region. And some of that, I think, is of course, with Western attention, Western support. So maybe as an opening question, and I'm happy to take some from the audience moving forward as well, is how do you judge U.S., European interest in engagement in your countries, the trend lines perhaps currently, and where you see those moving forward? So perhaps I will start with Ukraine, and then we'll go to Georgia and round back out, of course, to our European partners.
How do I judge current involvement of Western countries in Ukraine?
The trend lines. How do you see the trend lines going in terms of U.S. and European engagement in Ukraine?
So we already discussed that the help from US was delayed, and we already discussed the consequences of it. So as for Europe, my current research is why Ukraine got candidate country status, and I did my interviews in Brussels, and I see that the EU is trying already to play geopolitically and becoming more geopolitical actor and less afraid of Russia, because for years cooperation with Russia was more important for EU, and that's why this cooperation with Ukraine was close. So EU is becoming more active, I would say. US was always active in supporting Ukraine. Now, of course, with the war, majority of support we receive from US. Of course, as my colleague mentioned, we need much more. And of course, as I mentioned, Russia is still strong. And the only opportunity how Ukraine can fight and possibly win the war is to fight Russia with innovation technology. So Ukraine needs have more weapons so that to save lives and to overcome this Russian supremacy. And so more is needed, of course, that's the point. But EU is engaging much more than before, and EU is helping also military financially. So it's a huge change of EU strategy towards Ukraine after this invasion. And there are discussions in the EU what will happen if Trump comes and if US stops supporting Ukraine. So it's already positive that these discussions are going on. And so I would say EU is much more interested in Ukraine and in this war than it was in 2014. But yeah, more is needed, yeah.
Yuri, or if you have any thoughts on US trend lines, yes.
Yeah, actually, more is needed. More is needed is very correct. I mean, today and in this week, we are waiting for, as I told you, the US delegation is already here. Some of our European allies are coming. And, somehow we think that it can be on the agenda's classical de-escalation of the process, which is always postponing the reality and the problem. So I would encourage stronger and clear policy towards Georgia, Ukraine, and generally on Black Sea region, because we have a very difficult moment now, and if we're swallowed, then things are going to be very difficult to get back. So I think US policy has to be way more stronger, and they have to. About Ukraine, we just saw the long process before US could pass the bill to send the aid to Ukraine. So it's not the situation which is satisfactory, of course.
Thank you. Do you have any thoughts on fatigue in Europe in terms of engagement in the region?
Plenty. If you're asking me, can I put my trust into strategic autonomy? I mean, we're at Hudson, and I'm a proud European, but it's a bit difficult. I'll say it is a welcome change that we're seeing in the past few months with France. France has not been a leader in this war at the beginning, and is really trying to change gears and trying to rally support that already exists along the eastern flank, particularly the Baltics and Poland, but others too. And so my hopes are going up a bit. I have to see the full part of the glass here too. And so this momentum that France is trying to create under Macron, I think is encouraging. But if you're asking me, and I think it was Dadibor who mentioned this earlier, I tend to agree with him that the Europeans without the Americans, as much pain as it makes me or determines me to say that, is not gonna fly. It's not gonna be sufficient, and it's not just about the dollars or the euros. but it's about U.S. leadership. And we are seeing in the region and beyond what happens in the absence of U.S. leadership. So zooming here into Washington, D.C., I'm afraid this is looking pretty dire, independent of who is winning elections. It looks like it was extremely hard to get politically, due to mistakes made on both sides of the political aisle, to get the support through with the supplemental. We've all seen it and counted painfully the days. But if we're looking beyond the elections, independent of whether we'll have Biden staying for a second term or Trump returning for a second term, it looks like we're not, the possibility of us changing gears and indeed creating a strategy to enable Ukraine to win, whatever that looks like at this point, but win instead of prevent them from losing will not have the political momentum to take shape. So the worst case scenario is whether we're looking at either or the other administration forcing Ukraine to a negotiation that, as we've learned from Alina, can only temporize things or freeze things for a few years until Russia, with Putin or someone else, finds the political momentum to strike again. And so whether that's in Ukraine and all of it, or that's next door, we've heard, I think, today from someone from the French government saying, well, one of Russia's plans is to strike, create small invasions into NATO territory if things are going into the same direction politically. So I'm afraid indifferent of where one is on the political aisle, I don't see the political momentum for the gears to shift.
Thank you. Luke.
Thanks. My question's for Georgi. You gave us a brief outline. Excuse me, lose my voice today. Not good. My wife will be happy about that, but I said to speak on a panel next. Georgi, you mentioned a brief outline on the next few days, a third reading and final reading tomorrow, off to the president, then a veto from the president, and then the Georgian Dream has to overrule the veto, which of course they have the votes to do so. But can you tell us, when all of this happens, what the next coming weeks will look like? When are the next big flashpoints? Are the demonstrators showing resilience? The numbers are huge, 200,000 people, I think, in the most recent large-scale demonstration. We're starting to see the demonstrations spread to different cities around Georgia. The weather seems to be okay, but is morale staying high? Will these demonstrations last? And what is the end state of these demonstrations? Thanks. On one more, do you feel personally at risk? Do you feel safe? I know you're a vocal critic and you're a leader in civil society, and many of your friends and colleagues have been beaten by police. How do you personally feel yourself? Thanks.
Look, thank you very much. You know, we're ready for everything. When you fight against the current government, you have to know that you can be arrested, you can be beaten, and so many friends of mine were beaten during last days, and some of them arrested. But I mean, the moral is highest I have ever seen in Georgia. As I told you, government tries to scare people. I mean, I don't know, imagined new methods to call the families, to somehow scare them in order to prevent going them on the demonstrations, but nothing works, nothing works. Gen Z is just very active. So many youth are there every day, and they are not going, they are not gonna step back, because they just know that everything is dependent now on that law. Either we are on the Western track or on a Russian track, and nobody wants this country to see again part of the Russia or even part of the Russian influence. This is very clear message from the Georgian society, either youth or elderly people, but youth are very active. I mean, this kind of freedom fighting, what we are just seeing in Georgia is unprecedented, and I cannot imagine that government will be allowed to finally overcome the veto, or even if they do it, how stable they are going to be, I'm not sure, because moral is, as I told you, highest ever I saw in Georgia during last, I don't know, 15, 18 years. Nobody is gonna stop.
Thank you for that. Dalibor.
I have a quick question for Alina. So you're based in Switzerland. We've heard the news of the upcoming peace conference to be held in Switzerland next month. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about your expectations of this, how this works out? There are different rumors going around Washington about what the administration might try to do, about strong arming Ukrainians into accepting some sort of deal or whatnot. So if you could just sort of expand on what's what we should be expecting next month, particularly through the prism of President Zelensky's 10-point peace plan and how this might or might not align with that. Thank you.
And if I can add, would you tell us about China? Whether China is participating and what you're expecting from that?
Thank you so much. So I'm not one of the organizers, so I cannot tell you all the details. I'm just what I see, what I hear. Russia was not invited, and the Ukraine was against inviting Russia. Although Switzerland is very much involved with Russia, so Swiss foreign minister can meet with Russian foreign minister and post a picture. That's so cool. We discuss different things. So there's a total different approach in Switzerland. But at this time, Russia will not be there, and for Ukraine to win the war, Russia needs to be defeated. Russia needs to take its forces from Ukraine. So Russia needs to be forced for this. So I think what will be discussed, some different kind of security guarantees for Ukraine instead of NATO, and there will be if some viable option will be developed, it's not very likely that it can happen so quickly. And then there will be this NATO summit, and so there will be like two different options, whether Ukraine will be offered perspective to join NATO or some other alternative security guarantees, whether these other security guarantees can be viable. Of course, support for Ukraine, but again, it depends, as we heard, and as you know, Ukraine is dependent mostly on US support. It will depend on the elections in US and then further policies. So it will not be decided there what will happen in US. So about China, it's still unknown. I remember talking at Swiss Peace just two months ago, and a person from Chinese embassy somehow came to my presentation, not being invited, just got interested and came from another city, and he was interested. He bought my book. So I was very happy that he would read something else, and not just Russian propaganda of the war. And we're trying to ask him whether China will come, and he, like Chinese, they cannot say no, but they cannot say yes, and he didn't answer the question. At the moment, it's also unknown. And Switzerland, they want, of course, to involve China and India and everybody. And that might be workable because, as I said, Russia is still strong, but part of its strength is reorientation of its economy and its support from India, China, and African states. So if the West manages somehow to convince these countries to be less supportive of Russia, that's a way to make Russia weaker as well. US is already trying with China, but maybe we'll see more of these African states. There will not be Iran, but if somehow we manage to stop cooperation between Iran and Russia, that would be a huge support for Ukraine. But India and China, maybe if they come and if they got somehow convinced, that would be nice. But I wouldn't expect that there will be peace the next day after the conference because there are so many other factors. But I'm, of course, happy that it's happening and there will be discussions and possibility of new support for Ukraine, more attention, and some discussions forward alternative security guarantees for Ukraine instead of NATO.
So we're running up against time, so maybe I'll ask a final question. This is directed mostly to you, Yulia, but if either of our other panelists would like to weigh in. The other regional power, of course, is Turkey, and you offered to give us a bit of a flavor on where Turkey is and perhaps how we could nudge them further to play more of a constructive role in the Black Sea region. So maybe if you would touch on that, and if either of you would like to weigh in as well, and then we'll wrap up.
Sure. Unfortunately, I would have more insights in a few weeks. I'm heading to Turkey soon to learn more about how changeable or unchangeable their positions are. In some, we have something called the Montreux Convention that Turkey is invoking at every opportunity in the context of the Black Sea, that's sort of summing up the Black Sea policy for them. It's a convention that was signed between the Kingdom of Yugoslavia and the Kingdom of Romania and the Kingdom of Bulgaria. Australia was a co-signer. So, you know, it's been a while and not sure how relevant it is. And there's a lot of exceptions to it. Take the Ukrainian aircraft carrier that is not supposed to be leaving the Black Sea because it is an aircraft carrier, yet when the Chinese Prime Minister insisted and came to Ankara and offered Turkey a major economic and tourism deal, Turkey let it through to go to China and to become the flagship, literally the flagship of the Chinese Navy as we speak. So things are very connected and very complicated there. But in essence, this is a policy of keeping the West out that predates Erdogan, and that I have found is very strong across the Ankara establishment. And so we've seen how much Turkey has managed to play a strong game, including in the Black Sea, by holding Swedish membership to NATO hostage for a while. And during that time, as the full-scale invasion was developing, the United States government was telling us, don't push Turkey too much on this, because as long as Sweden is not on board, we cannot be thinking about Black Sea security. Now that that's been resolved, and with the Turkish economic situation being in dire straits, to put it bluntly, we can anticipate that there might be willingness from the Turkish side, as they've seen also how the balance of power in the Black Sea is not in their favor, and how NATO can play a positive role in that, to get Turkey to make some concessions on that or change its position on that. However, that would mean that we're playing a bit of a cat and mouse game, because now the question is, to what extent is sometimes the administration here in Washington hiding behind Turkey's veto, because they have limited resources that they want to dedicate to Black Sea security. And so it's a matter of, on the one hand, how much is Turkey willing to negotiate, but for that to for us to find that out, we also have to put on the table what we are willing to invest into Black Sea security. And there cannot be Black Sea security without Turkey as a vital NATO member in the region. And so hopefully there will be more on this at the NATO summit, though I'm not very confident that there will be. Hopefully there will be more focus there. And hopefully after the NATO summit in the coming months, if we find the political will here as well in Washington as well as in Brussels, we can start a more meaningful and content-driven conversation that Turkey, I'm guessing, will not say no to find a win-win for more Western security and more Western investments towards Russian deterrence in the Black Sea region with Turkey's buy-in.
Thank you. Any closing thoughts to read Turkey from Georgia or Ukraine? You certainly don't have to, but if you do.
Exactly, I would fully agree. Both Alina and Yulia, Turkey is a very important country to balance Russia and Black Sea region, and the upcoming NATO summit is opportunity to make Turkey more interested, and NATO actually more interested that region, which can be evaluated by Turkey, of course, right? So if we have, for example, more active Turkey now, we would not face the same problem, the problem we are facing. So this is the big help for Georgia, for Ukraine, and the whole region. So upcoming NATO summit would be the great opportunity to discuss that issue. I'm not that confident, but if we all advocate this policy, it may happen.
Any closing thoughts?
Yes, I agree. Turkey is also an important economic partner to Russia. If we convince Turkey to stop anything with Russia, it would be also helpful for Ukraine. And it's unbelievable that Turkey is NATO member and it still has friendly relations with NATO.
With Russia.
Oh, with Russia, yes.
Thank you.
So in this context as well, we need more active United States.
Either way.
U.S. leadership is definitely the theme connecting this panel. Just one brief housekeeping for those online and here. We're going to take about a 10-minute coffee break. There's coffee and donuts for those here in person. And I ask those online to please stick with us. We have a terrific panel on the Balkans upcoming. And otherwise, please give a round of applause to our great panelists today. That was a terrific discussion.
All right. Is the sound on?
We're live.
All right, we're live. All right. Thank you all for tuning in online, and I would like to thank all of you for coming here in person to hopefully participate in this excellent panel discussion that we have coming up. I would like to again thank the people at the Hudson Institute, Luke especially, for helping put this together, as well as Richard, of course. I think it's been an excellent first discussion about the Black Sea region that those of us who follow the Balkans more than other regions do not know as much about. So we've certainly been enlightened because of what we heard. I'm going to start this panel discussion by laying out what happened in the last 12 months or so since we had a similar discussion at the William and Mary here in Washington about 14 months ago. It was the anniversary of the second Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the world was a very different place a year ago than it is today, namely because of what we heard during the first panel, Russia's ability to still project power in Ukraine. I'm not going to say the Russians are going to necessarily break through the front lines, and I like that we heard some optimism from the speakers at the previous panel. But all of that has an effect on the Balkans, which is the subject of our panel today. Tanya Domi couldn't make it. She was supposed to moderate this panel, so I jumped in and changed roles from participant in the panel to moderator, and we want to send her best regards. It's a family issue. Hopefully everything turns out okay. So Dan, we're going to start with you, and my question is going to be extremely leading, as always. So the Biden administration has engaged considerably in the region. I think most of us following the region would agree with that assessment. We were very unhappy with the Trump administration, previously with Obama too as well, because there wasn't as much attention being paid to the region. And then comes along the most informed, the most well-equipped administration to deal with the Balkans, probably in history, with the most high-profile appointees across the administration who know the region extremely well. And then 3 and some years later, I think there's almost a near consensus in the analyst community that the administration has failed, more or less. I would give them a D or a D minus overall if I were to grade them. And having participated in the Biden campaign starting in Iowa, I think I have a right to be an objective observer of what is going on. So Croatia got what it wanted in the region, got the government in Bosnia imposed, which now is heavily criticized across the international forums because of their connections with the drug cartel from Dubai, the Dino and Tito drug cartel, and the threats against journalists like Avdo Avdic, who was threatened recently. I want to abuse this position to mention his name because there were threats against him issued by the members of the cartel and the government recently. The Serbian government was appeased by a new government in Montenegro, right, which contains elements that are friendly to Serbia. The relationship between Biden administration and Kosovo is poor, at best. And the focus on the three sort of pivotal countries in the region is more than apparent. I think we can conclude that Biden administration is focused on fixing relations with Croatia, fixing relations with Serbia, and deepening ties with Albania. And the other 3 or 4 countries in the region were sort of pushed aside. Am I right in assuming this, Dan?
Oh, thanks for the opportunity. Yes, I think you're basically right, but I'm going to talk about only one of those 3 countries, and that's Serbia. And here, I think there's a certain complementarity between the Black Sea panel and this panel, because in the Black Sea panel, what we heard was we need more. We need more assistance from the US, more focus by the US, more focus by NATO. And my message to you about Serbia in particular, but maybe the Balkans in general, is that we need less. And we need less money, and we need less diplomacy. That's unusual for me to say. Now, why do I think this? I think this mainly because President Vučić has made his position absolutely clear. He is strategically aligned with China and Russia. He has signed strategic partnerships with both President Xi and President Putin. And he in many other ways has made that strategic alignment absolutely clear. So I think, you know, the current administration is still talking Europe whole and free. I would love to see Europe whole and free. I hope to live to see Europe whole and free. But it's not going to be whole and free the next few years. There's going to be a line drawn in Europe. And that line, in my view, clearly goes through the Balkans, not around the Balkans. And it goes through Bosnia and Herzegovina with Republika Srpska on the eastern side of that line. And it goes through the rest of the Balkans with Serbia having chosen, not having been forced to, but having chosen to be on the eastern side of that line. You know, Alina in the previous panel said that when Putin says something, you should take him seriously. And I agree with that. When Vučić says something, you should take him seriously too. He is not a proxy for Moscow. He gets lots of support from Moscow. That's absolutely true. But he is a principal in his own right. He has agency. And he has chosen his geopolitical alignment. And the question we should have is, why did he choose that geopolitical alignment? Now, it's absolutely true that ethno-nationalist autocratic preference comes naturally to Vučić, who learned his politics at Slobodan Milosevic's knee. But he really did have a choice in 2014. I'm one of those who reached out to him during that period, hoping he would turn Serbia westward. I arranged his first public appearance in Washington, D.C. at Johns Hopkins SAIS. He has long talked pro-EU, but if deeds followed words, Serbia would today be a consolidated democracy well on its way to EU accession. Instead, it's drifted towards authoritarian rule. Freedom House now ranks it as partly free. It's a strange euphemism to me. Its ruling party, I think this sentence is the key sentence from Freedom House, has steadily eroded political rights and civil liberties, putting pressure on independent media, the political opposition, and civil society organizations. But Vučić has not only presided over Serbia's democratic decline, he has encouraged it. Many Balkan watchers complain about what they call, I don't know how you're supposed to pronounce it, stabilitocracy. They mean by that the alleged Western preference for incumbent rulers because they provide stability despite democratic shortcomings. I don't believe that theory is accurate. Why don't I believe it is accurate? Because it ignores the fates of Prime Minister Gruevski of Macedonia, Montenegro, and President Đukanović of Montenegro, and Kosovo President Daci, all of whom have been displaced without the West resisting. In the case of Gruevski, they actually assisted in his displacement. I think Vučić worries I hope rightly, that if someday he faces defeat in an election or an indictment in an international court, no one in Europe or the US will trouble much about it. And I think that's one of the reasons he's aligned the way he's aligned. There are no doubt economic reasons for his autocratic drift as well. China is not beneficent, but its mining, rail, and tire projects and investments leave ample room for hiring well-connected locals and supporting local oligarchs who in turn support Vučić. And both the Chinese and Russians are willing to go a yard farther than the Americans and West Europeans in providing internal security technology. And that's a factor as well. But all of those factors, ethno-nationalism, fear that he might be displaced and not supported by the West, the economic factors, none of them, in my view, are the really decisive factor in Vučić's alignment with the East. He's aligned with China and Russia because they take what they want without offering excuses. At least Russia has done that in Ukraine. And Vučić wants to govern all the Serbs of the Balkans. He's made that absolutely clear. The Serbian home should be taken seriously. It is another way of talking about Greater Serbia. Now, would he try to achieve it the way Milosevic did in one military leap? No. He's going to try to achieve it first de facto with economic cooperation and then de jure when the geopolitical situation permits. And he's made that absolutely clear. He gave an interview in December in which he talked about how he was awaiting the kind of circumstances that enabled Azerbaijan to do what it did with Nagorno-Karabakh. In fact, Vučić has been partly successful already. I mean, he all but owns Republika Srpska at this point. Dodik's freedom of action, which he had in the past, is much less than it used to be. He owns Montenegro by democratic means, basically. I mean, for whatever reasons, the people chose a pro-Russian president, a pro-Russian government. That won't be possible with Kosovo. Kosovo is not going to go to Serbia peacefully, and Albin Kurti has made it absolutely clear that he will resist any territorial expansion into northern Kosovo or any place else. But Vučić hasn't given up. I mean, why else does Vulin, the former defense minister, prime advocate of Serbian home, why is he a deputy prime minister? He was the one who claims credit for having organized the terrorist incident in last year on September 24th, if I got it right. And that incident was intended to create the pretext for a military invasion of Kosovo. The new prime minister was defense minister last year when a rent-a crowd attacked NATO peacekeepers and when Serbia kidnapped police from the territory of Kosovo. He denies genocide in Bosnia, and he talks about Montenegro the way Putin talks about Ukraine. It's that same fraternity, which means I don't really recognize their separate identity. He shows no sign. The new prime minister has not said a word about the two agreements signed in February and March that the EU and US claim are legally binding. Not only does he not say anything in public about them, he doesn't say anything about them to EU diplomats who call on him. And they call on him without mentioning them, which is extraordinary. The Chinese and Russians are important to Vučić because they help him to keep his territorial ambitions alive. And we should take those ambitions seriously. He's talked about them, he's stated and restated them, and we need to extinguish that ambition. Only then will Serbia be a real candidate to turn westward. It'll be difficult to do that until Biden wins in November. Rev, I know how disappointed you are in Biden. I'm disappointed too, though maybe not as surprised, because I testified before him when he was a senator, and he made very clear that he wanted to convince Serbia to come west. He wanted Serbia in the EU accession process at a time when I was saying they're not qualified for EU accession. So I'm not as surprised as you are, but it's very clear that from the point of view of democracy in the Balkans, that a Trump victory will be disastrous and will lead to, I think, ethno-territorial partition. Why shouldn't it? Trump is essentially an ethno-territorial politician. That's his message to Americans, and that'll be his message abroad. It'll be impossible to turn Serbia to the west if Trump or the Russians win. That's very clear. Washington, Donbass, and Crimea will decide the fate of the Balkans.
Washington
Donbass
and
Crimea will decide the fate of the Balkans. But again, Vučić is not just an agent of the Russians. He is a principal who has his own ambitions. And the way to defeat those ambitions is with less diplomacy, less EU sponsorship of a dialogue that can't go anyplace on normalization, and less money. There's several $100 million that could be saved by cutting off Western and World Bank and other multilateral bank assistance to Serbia. And that's what we ought to do.
All right, thank you, Daniel. Our next speaker is Ivana Stradner. She's now at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. She was previously at the American Enterprise Institute, and she's, in my view, one of the most consequential analysts, Balkans analysts in Washington, if not the most important one at the moment. So thank you for being on our panel, and I know you're going to disagree with Dan on some of these points, but my question to you is, Donbass, Crimea, and Washington going to decide the fate of the Balkans? As Dan says.
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this panel, and thank you, Richard, for organizing this, and Hudson. To begin with, the very first fact that we spend 1 hour talking about a tiny landlocked country, it tells you all you really need to know how a lot of people misunderstand what is truly going on in the Balkans. And it's understandable why, because the Balkans has not been on the agenda for almost 3 decades. Very few people actually speak all the languages from the region, but not even that, it's actually even worse. One thing that I learned, I was, by the way, born in the region. And one thing that I learned about a lot of Western analysts is they like to think that the world thinks like them, process emotions, process feelings, process information, and make decisions using a very similar cost-benefit analysis. That's certainly not the case how many leaders in the Balkans operate. Identity politics matter, different religion dynamics matter, and cost-benefit analysis that is based on some admirable goals towards the West are oftentimes misunderstood. But this is the plot twist. Putin and Vucic understand something what many leaders in the West do not understand. They learned how to talk to the West, but the West forgot how to talk to them. President Vucic, he was the Minister of Information during 1999. Feel free to go and check influence operations and psychological operations during that time. Having said that, Serbia shaped the information space very much during 1999. It's one of the most powerful things. And why that matters? It matters because President Vucic, one of his most powerful tools is actually how to shape the information space and create perceptions based at the same time, and this is a paradox, on a powerful Serbia with limited power. Therefore, providing the West with only one opportunity and only one strategy, you have to support Serbia to have the stability in the region. Without Serbia, there is no stability in the region. It is exactly what a lot of people here believe. When in fact, he is the one who has been escalating the crisis and then de-escalating and positioning himself as a source of stability. And I'll just give you a very concrete example. I wrote a couple of articles before last May that Serbia was planning to organize chaos in the region. People told me, it makes no sense. It's a tiny landlocked country. Why would you ever expect such a country to go to war with NATO? Last May, in 2023, 90, I will repeat, 90, 90 NATO peacekeepers were injured in Kosovo with clashes with NATO peacekeepers. What did NATO do? Nothing. What did Washington do? Nothing. And that's exactly what Putin and Vucic understand. And the reason why the West was silent, it was because once you recognize that, you have to do something about that. And the last thing that the West wants right now is another conflict in Europe. And it's exactly also what Putin understands. I don't believe as of today that he plans to attack NATO member state in the Baltics in 2024. But I do believe what we saw last May, this was a round one, very soon we might see their second round. Why? To show that the alliance is a paper tiger. And as Dan said, believe Putin when he says something, and what was stated in the previous panel. One of his desires is to truly to show that NATO is a paper tiger. Second thing, oftentimes I hear in the West that the Serbian government wants to bring the country towards the West. And without Serbia, it's impossible to bring any other country in the region towards the West. So let's appease and give whatever the Serbian government wants, because without Vucic, there is no leadership towards the West. The question of linguistics, and I invite every leader in the West to hire good translators and to translate the difference between being on the European Union path versus being and striving towards European Union membership. I challenge everyone to compare and contrast Vucic's statements towards I want Serbia in the European Union versus we are on the European Union path. And of course that he needs the European Union towards his path. He needs money, he needs support, and he needs a leverage with Russia and China. Without the European Union, his government will not be able to sustain. He needs the European Union more than the European Union needs him. But there is another trick. A lot of bureaucrats in the European Union, all they truly need to do is basically to make sure you know that in the end of a day, after their 8-hour-long work, that they can submit something. And the second thing is risk aversion pays off in Washington and Brussels. It has always been like that, and it was also during the 90s. And also, let me remind you, in the 90s, the United States was the superpower. It was the unipolar, in the unipolar world. Even then, It took the West more than 5 years to do something in the region. Having said that, I was very little, back then to read in real time the news, but there are a lot of information right now that I can see. And after the end of the Cold War, it was that idea. It's the end of the Cold War. Economy is going to thrive. Open market. That's going to prevent the wars. And that's exactly what a lot of people in the West, even nowadays, think about that, which is exactly what Serbia and Russia want to do, to build the image that they are towards the West. The third point. Even though some people believe that Serbia is not willing and able, with the help of Russia, to conduct military operation, that's not a point. The concept of hybrid war that we understand here is very different from the way that Russia understands. And the former chief of intelligence of Serbia had very strong ties to Russia. Just read his statements about the creation of the Serbian world, but more importantly, how they define hybrid war. They do not need literally to use any ammunition or weapons to accomplish their goals. Montenegro, just as Professor Server just stated, was absolutely under full control of the Serbian government, using the Serbian Orthodox Church. With very high confidence, I do believe that very similar strategy will be employed very, very soon in North Macedonia, another NATO member state. Why? Just as Putin feared democratic processes in his region and all those countries moving towards the West, it's exactly what President Vučić fears for his region. And by making sure that all those countries are democratically declining and are less and less willing to make ties with the West, he can always say, I know, we are not going towards best, but look now like North Macedonia. They're aligning themselves with Russia. Just look at Montenegro. Just look at their policies. We are not the worst. And my fourth last point is ideology. Ideology matters. At the same time, just that there is no feasible opposition in Serbia to change currently any policies, that also gives a leverage to the president of Serbia, along with its allies such as Russia and China, to build narratives in the region. But ideology matters. If you go back and look at Vučić's statements in the past, including what Professor Server just said about Azerbaijan and Nagorno-Karabakh, believe them, it's just a matter of time. And promoting democracy has not been on the Western agenda in the region for quite some time, other than, doing certain events that, with all due respect, nobody cares about, and writing reports that nobody reads. Ideology matters, and kindness is weakness for authoritarian leaders, and weakness emboldens them. What we saw last week with China, and just recently, the new government that has 2 people that are in sanctions by the United States, it tells you all you need to know. And while the West is waiting, certainly for a better time to hope, once Ukraine wins, that the Balkans will follow. A lot of things might happen in the meantime. There is a very similar strategy that Putin has employed in places such as Georgia, Moldova, but also the Balkans. And my last point is that the government of Serbia, they are certainly not the victims of Russian and Chinese influence. They're enablers, and they need that for their political survival. So having said that, I truly hope there will be more and more people paying attention to this region, even though that Serbia is a tiny landlocked country. I do believe that very, very, very challenging times are on the horizon, because what we saw last May and last September, it was around one. The US intelligence earlier this year, they warned about new escalations. And no, Russia does not need to send tanks and jets. They're operating in a very similar way, just like Russia's actions in Ukraine with Special Operation Forces, aka Little Green Man. So I truly hope that I'll be wrong this time.
All right, thank you, Ivana. Our next speaker is Mr. Lou Coffey, who's a senior fellow here at Hudson. He spent a number of years previously at the Heritage Foundation, and he wrote a piece, I believe it was May 4th, on the region for Arab News, was it?
Yep.
And in which he very bluntly said that the Balkans, the Western Balkans, is the next flashpoint, world's next flashpoint, I believe it was. That's how you put it, I believe, Luke. So would you care to elaborate on that? Because I found it to be a very brave assessment in terms of, you know, the analyst community. People often refrain from using such, you know, direct language.
Well, I had to get clicks. So, no, I'm joking. Okay. No, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Hopefully my voice will hold up for this panel. You know, I wrote that article because I do believe that the West is sleepwalking into the next big geopolitical crisis, certainly in Europe, if not, you know, potentially global. Precisely because of the reasons you've already heard today. Russia sees the Balkans as one of the areas where it can ratchet up or turn up the pressure or the heat on the Euro-Atlantic community in what is a very low-cost manner. We in the West tend to view these different regions and issues as being separate, whereas Russia views all of these different geopolitical issues and crises around the world as being interconnected. When Russia goes to the Balkans poker table, it brings its poker chips from the Ukraine table, from the Syria table, from the Arctic table, for example. When we go to the Balkans poker table, we just bring our Balkans poker chips. And admittedly, we don't have very many of them because of a lack of coordination or focus or policy on the region. So we have to start seeing what Russia is doing in the region as being connected with what Russia is doing in other regions. And when we start seeing how all of these are interconnected, then we can start formulating a more coherent policy. Of course, Russia does have a lot of influence in the region, but as Ivana said, Vučić also has a lot of agency and is able to act to a certain degree independently to pursue his own interests. But I'd like to describe Russia's interests in the Balkans as being a gas stove. You can ignite the flame on the gas stove, you can turn it up high, you can turn it down low, you can kind of get it sort of in between, but you can't be very precise with the temperature of a gas stove. And that's how I think Russia sees the Balkans. They can turn it up, turn it down, kind of keep it simmering, but they can't precisely get the right temperature, which that in itself comes with a lot of risks because Russia, in that sense, could be very unpredictable in the region. I think a lot of Americans ask, well, why does this matter to the United States? And that's a fair question. On the most basic level, I would say that the American family and American taxpayer has sacrificed a lot in the Balkans, certainly in the 1990s over the years. Thousands of U.S. soldiers have deployed through the region. Tens of millions of dollars have been spent, perhaps hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent in the region with aid efforts, development efforts, reconstruction efforts. So we have a stake in it, and if we pursue the right policies, we could maintain a certain level of stability without another great U.S. investment. But on the bigger level, when you look at how crucial this region is to the overall stability of Europe, I mean, certainly from a historical point of view, a lot of Europe's problems in the past couple of centuries often originates or is connected to Southeastern Europe. When you look at the crucial importance of this region to Europe's stability, this should matter to the average American because Europe is America's largest export market. Europe and the U.S. together account for almost half of the world's GDP. And anything that undermines the stability and security of America's largest export market should be a concern to American policymakers and to Americans. 48 out of 50 American states export more to Europe than they do to China, for example. And when an American is building a product to be exported, that's a job. And we don't want to risk anything undermining the stability and security in Europe that has led to the economic prosperity on the continent that not only benefits the European economy and the American economy, but ultimately the American worker. So this is why we should keep a close eye on the situation. I wanted to highlight a few points over the next few months that I think U.S. policymakers should be keeping an eye on, and then outline a few things, basically very modest suggestions on what we can do to help. The first point we need to keep an eye on is, I think this Wednesday, the UN General Assembly will be voting on the resolution for declaring July 11th the International Day of Remembrance of the Genocide of Srebrenica. Dodik himself has said if this passes in the UN General Assembly, he will seek the next opportunity to call for independence from Bosnia and Herzegovina. Of course, this would unravel Dayton and set a dangerous precedent, but also create a major geopolitical crisis. I don't think it'll be as simple as the vote passes and the next day he's going to try to declare independence, but I think it could be the start of a process that could lead to him trying to do that. This vote has been, I think, delayed already twice, and we'll see if it happens this Wednesday. But when you have very vocal genocide deniers when it comes to what happened in Bosnia in the 90s, using this vote to rally support and to get emotions running high, this could be a recipe for disaster in a region like the Balkans. So we need to keep an eye on what happens this Wednesday. The next thing we need to keep an eye on is it starts on July 1st, and that is when Hungary takes over the rotating presidency of the Council of the European Union. We know that Viktor Orban has a very cozy relationship with Vučić, and we also know that the EU has a leading role and has a major stake in stability and security in the Balkans, and of course the Balkans being an area of unfinished business for Euro-Atlantic integration. So I'm not here to make any predictions or say it's going to be dire, but if you look at the rhetoric coming from Orban in the past, and you look at the cozy relationship he has with Belgrade, it's worth keeping an eye on how the presidency, how Hungary's holding of this presidency can shape or not shape EU policy or focus for the second half of this year. And then, of course, the one issue I always keep a very close eye on, especially in recent years, is when the UN Security Council mandate is renewed that allows for the European Union military mission in Bosnia. Every year in the fall, we always hear this drumbeat of Russia's going to veto it, and in the end, they never do. But as relations continue to deteriorate between the West and Russia, I think this is something to keep an eye on. I only mention this because, and perhaps there are EU legal scholars that can say better and know far more than I do on this, but I do know that for any EU CSDP mission, it requires a UN Security Council mandate, and if that mandate disappears, then it creates a legal dilemma for the EU to continue its military mission in Bosnia. Now, what do we do going forward? Firstly, US policymakers need to open up a map and locate the Balkans and realize it's separate from the Baltics. I can't tell how many times I've heard US politicians, they think they're talking about the Baltics and they say Balkans, or they think they're talking about the Balkans and they actually are talking about the Baltics. It's kind of embarrassing, but that's the state of play in many places around Washington. So let's open up a map and rediscover this region. And let's get a high-level visit or two to the region. The last presidential visit to the Balkans was George W. Bush in 2008. So we're long overdue. We could also use more senior cabinet level visits to the region just to show U.S. commitment and resolve. I think that would go a long way. I think we, as Americans, we take it for granted, but we underestimate the impact of a very high level visit on the ground, especially at the presidential level. With things very tense in Bosnia and Herzegovina because of Dodik's successionist rhetoric, I would like to see this EU mission not reinforced permanently, although I think it could probably use some more troops. It currently stands at 1,600. But I would like to see an EU-led military exercise on reinforcing this mission, to practice and rehearse that. These sort of snap exercises can send their own signals, and I think that projecting strength and consistency to a leader like Vučić is very important. So I think I think that would go a long way, and that would be at a very low cost for the EU to do. There needs to be very close US, UK, EU coordination. Since Brexit, the UK unfortunately left the U4 group, mission in Bosnia. Even though there are third country contributing nations that contribute to this mission, unfortunately the UK stopped. I would like to see more coordination between Brussels, London, and DC on this region. I think one of the positive developments in European affairs that has resulted from Russia's large-scale invasion of Ukraine is that it's removed these post-Brexit anxieties that many countries had in Europe. What does it mean now that the UK is not in the EU? How do we continue to work with the UK on European affairs? And the British leadership, certainly in the first few months of the first year of Russia's large-scale invasion, I think, reminded European countries that EU membership or not, the UK is a continental power, has been for centuries, will be for centuries, and the UK has an interest in the Balkans as well. And then final point is we have a NATO summit coming up. A lot of backslapping congratulations will be taking place at this summit, 75th anniversary of the alliance. The Biden administration wants the summit to be a celebratory event at a time when the largest land war is taking place in Europe since the Second World War, and at a time when parts of Europe, like the Balkans, remain on the cusp of major instability. Instead of celebrating NATO's history at the summit, NATO should be making history at the summit by showing that the door is open for new members and getting the Balkans on the agenda at the summit coming up. So I'll stop there. I think that's enough food for thought.
Thank you very much, Mr. Coffey. I have we're going to engage with the audience. I'm just going to first ask you to just give a bit more on your initial presentations. I'm going to ask Dan first, of course. The most difficult question of all, the elephant in the room, which is that we have an administration that understands that the Balkans is not a geopolitical Las Vegas. What happens in the Balkans does not stay in the Balkans, right? And we have the most brilliant American diplomat dealing with the Balkans, I would say, since you, Daniel, left the State Department. I mean, I don't think there's, and I mean that with all sincerity, Jim O'Brien understands the region extremely well. I mean, I am really looking for somebody who would, be his sort of predecessor, except I don't see anybody except yourself. I mean, he really knows the region extremely well. And we have not seen a clear strategy from where I'm sitting. There is nothing resembling a strategy. what is America's strategy for the region? I mean, what is America trying to accomplish? Because we heard, Ivana's points about Belgrade's ties with Russia and China, what Luke said about how Moscow views the region. But if you compare what the analyst community is saying to what the Biden folks are saying, it's like we inhabit two different realities. I mean, they live in a reality that we do not simply see. I don't see it. And if you care to explain, what is Biden administration strategy in the region, and what is Jim's next move? Or is Jim going to make a move at all?
If I knew Jim's next move, I probably wouldn't tell it to you. Let me say this, that understanding the region is not what brings good policy. And we should have learned that in the last 3 years, because Lajčák knows the region extremely well. So does Escobar. But they made a bad policy choice from the very first when they tried to make Serbia the key to their policy in bringing Serbia westward. It was a colossal mistake. They're both now leaving. Farewell to failure. Jim O'Brien's...
So you're pinning it on Lajčák and Escobar?
They weren't doing what they were doing without approval higher up. But I don't think Blinken... The White House pays virtually no attention to the Balkans. I don't think Blinken paid a whole lot of attention to the Balkans. I think he allowed them to do what they wanted to do, and it failed. I know Jim O'Brien very well. I know that he'll have understood that there was a failure. What I don't know is what he's thinking for the future, except what he said in public. And what he said in public was not entirely, what shall I say, it wasn't wrong, and it indicates a future direction, but it doesn't tell us precisely what he would do. Because he met with Vučić, and he came out highlighting his difference with Vučić over the question of calling Srebrenica a genocidal operation. Well, I think this is an important difference with the previous incumbents who weren't willing to have that kind of difference with Vučić. It also suggests that somebody in the State Department understands that Vučić has made a strategic choice in the wrong direction. I find it hard to believe that they don't understand that, because he's made it as clear as he possibly could. So I do have some hope that there will be a new direction. I don't think the right direction is to revive the EU-sponsored dialogue that aimed at political normalization. Why? Because Vučić isn't ready for political normalization, and has made that very, very clear. I also doubt that Albin Kurti is entirely ready for it either, but it's really Vučić's refusal that counts at this point. I think a good direction for the future is to return to the more technical level dialogue that produced a lot of agreements up until 2013, some of which were very well implemented, not all of which have been implemented. But even in recent months, the license plate agreement, the electricity agreement, which had been negotiated in the technical talks before 2013, those are being implemented now. And that's a good thing. And it improves life for people in both Kosovo and in Serbia. And that, to me, is a good direction for the future. When I say that a line is going to be drawn in the Balkans and that Serbia is going to be on the eastern side of that line, I don't mean to say there's going to be an iron curtain in the Balkans. I think there'll be cooperation across that line. And we need to find areas where both sides are actually willing. And political normalization is not one of them.
All right. Thank you very much, Daniel. Ivana, the German edition of Le Monde Diplomatique published a very consequential piece several days ago on the agreement between German Mercedes-Benz and their supplier with the RS government on the exploitation of lithium in parts of Bosnia that are now on the RS side of the inter-entity boundary line. Yet there was no agreement, there was no tendering procedure, there was no agreement of any kind publicly available, made available to the public ever, and yet there was a Mercedes factory built, or is in the process of being built in Germany with German taxpayer money, and I was actually surprised by this, that the Germans would be willing to take such risks, basically showing that they're in partnership with the Dodik government at such a strategic level. Now, isn't this a better way to look at the region? Shouldn't we be looking at the region through the interests of the main Western players, namely the lithium in Serbia? I think is a huge asset for the Vučić government, because I think the Western governments are extremely interested in a Western company getting rights to this location in the west of Serbia, on the border of Bosnia and Serbia, or is the policy more easily explained by a set of circumstances, decisions of the lower level personnel, a strategy that Dan just, or understanding that Dan just outlined, that I would coin Comrade Stalin didn't know, which basically means that the upper levels of the US government had no idea what the medium level diplomats were doing, which is entirely possible having in mind what's going on in Ukraine.
So literally just before the event, I saw that article. And I was not surprised to see more and more trying to make economic cooperation there, because many analysts in the West believe the more economically the region basically receives investments, the more stable it's going to be. And there is one thing that is definitely so accurate about Dodik and Vučić, that are using all those investments as a bargaining chip. The same thing, with lithium. We're going to see, what China is going to say about that. So it's a very, very, very complex thing, because it's not only about lithium. There are other investments that the West has made with the goal of making the region stable. At the same time, Vučić, but also Dodik, have been using that also as a bargaining chip with the West and prolonging negotiations, et cetera, et cetera. Now, whether we need to look at that versus what's happening here in Washington and Brussels in terms of decision-making processes. Number one thing is, as I said, the Balkans is very complex, and we need to embrace the complexity. This is like a 4D chess. It's not even 3D. It's like a 4D chess. And in my view, one of the key strategies for the West is to keep the status quo. I don't see, as of today, any willingness to rattle the cage of Vučić and to change in terms of the rule of law. It's just like, let's keep it as it is, just so it does not escalate, which is exactly what Vučić has been playing the games by escalating and de-escalating. And one other thing that I forgot to say in my previous statement, but I really have to emphasize it now, is that how you can actually analyze the region. There is one thing in Russia's strategy, which is that they're always setting informational conditions before something happens. And even though we should believe, when Putin says certain things, we should also look at what's happening in information space before something happened. The reason, for example, last year, I was very, very convinced that something would happen in the Balkans in the fall because Russian Ministry of Defense media, Zvezda, announced that. They said the West was opening a second front in the region in the fall. And right now, they're using exactly the same analysis and they're setting informational conditions. Second thing, Russian Telegram channel, it's called Repercussions. They just opened a media school in the region in Serbia and Republika Srpska. They took over several projects. They said that they're basically teaching people on how to use influence operations. If there is one thing we should learn from 2014 in Ukraine is that how actually informational space is important for setting informational conditions, but also shaping the environment. And that's exactly, I couldn't agree more with Luke, that things are definitely heating up in the region. And my third point to that is about the West. The West has always been reactionary. We had an opportunity to send all the weapons Ukraine needed prior to 2022, when we already had some hints about what might happen in 2021, but out of fear of escalations, we decided not to. This time around, we're also reluctant to send all the weapons we need to Ukraine out of fear of nuclear escalations. So a very similar strategy Vučić and Dodik are also playing in the region out of fear of escalation, making sure that the West is remaining silent. And that's exactly the part of reflexive control that the Kremlin, along with Belgrade, are playing. I genuinely believe that China sending FK-3, missile defense, etc., like all these things are important, don't get me wrong, but that's not going to be a decisive for how the region is going downhill. It's much more complex, and how such campaigns are waged. All we really need to look at last May and last September, and to ask ourselves why we were silent.
All right, thank you, Ivana. Luke, having in mind your military background, how would you assess the military posture of the big players in the region, and especially U.S. military posture in the region? I mean, is the central, I mean, who is thinking about eventualities in the context of U.S. military for the region, for the Balkans?
Well, I should state that I left the U.S. military as a lowly captain. So I can't give too much of a perspective with my military hat on other than at a very junior officer level. But having worked at more strategic levels as a civilian, especially when I was working in the UK Ministry of Defense, maybe I could offer some perspective on this. I've already alluded to the fact that I think there's certain value in rehearsals and training exercises in advance of a potential crisis from breaking out, because it sends certain signals to potential adversaries. But also doing a snap exercise in the middle of a crisis, whether it's intended or not, could be escalatory. So doing it before the crisis to kind of preempt it or to deter, I think, is the preferred method. So I would like to see the EU mission and the over-horizon forces that are earmarked for that EU mission in Bosnia to rehearse deploying, going back to Bosnia, boosting the numbers. The same can be applied to Kosovo. We did see this actually happen in practice last year when things became very tense between KFOR and Serbia, and Kosovo and Serbia. But I think it would be a good idea to have a posture review of the current military and civilian missions that support the military and security dimensions in the Balkans, to figure out, hey, do we have the right number of troops where we need them? Do we have the correct chain of command and C2 arrangements? Do we have the right reinforcements earmarked in the event of a crisis? Do we have the proper levels of host nation support that can absorb large influxes of peacekeepers or coalition forces into the region if this is needed? and how can we get like-minded and friendly countries in the region to have a stake in all of this? So it's just not, a NATO or an EU face that's also a local face. I think these are important questions to have. Now, in terms of who would have the competency for this, you have the NATO mission in Kosovo, you have the EU mission in Bosnia. The EU mission is done under this mechanism called a Berlin Plus, which is this arrangement that allows the EU to draw down on NATO capabilities for these sort of missions. So I don't know if this is an area, maybe this is a good confidence building area for NATO and the EU when it comes to defense and security cooperation. Maybe it could be jointly done. But I do think it's probably been a while, and we need to review and look at some of the contingency plans and troop placements to see if they're appropriate for 2024.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to open the floor to questions from the audience now. If you could please introduce yourself.
Good morning, Tomasz Żornaczuk from the Polish Institute of International Affairs in Warsaw. I'm head of Central Europe and the Balkans department. I have a question regarding the technical part of the agreements between Serbia and Kosovo. This recommendation that we should focus on more technical aspects of this Brussels Accord is there for 10 years. But sadly, we can come to a conclusion that what we see as a technical act of, for example, changing numbers, plates on the car, is a very political issue, because you, sir, imagine yourself changing your American plates to the Canadian ones or to Mexican ones. It is not just a physical act of changing the plates, but it is a deeply attached to a construct of identity, including the national identity, which by itself is a very political question. The same for the association of the community of the Serbian municipalities in the north. So it is a political question. But I'm touching upon this issue because if myself, or as a representative of expert community from Europe, we lack arguments of what to do in the Balkans with Serbia, how the West should deal with it, because we have a feeling more and more than the state capture is that deep that the only thing can help is a revolution. So my question, because I'm looking for ideas to any of you, is what would be your sole recommendation to the West how to deal with Serbia in order not to lose the track on it? Thank you.
All right, so Daniel, I think the technical question is...
Well, you're absolutely right. All technical questions between Kosovo and Serbia can be recast as sovereignty questions. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But sometimes Serbia and Kosovo choose not to recast them that way. That's what happened eventually with license plates and with electricity, and it can happen with lots of other things. But you have to open the technical path and see who's willing to come into it. Right now, the single biggest issue on the technical side is what to do about currency in Kosovo, because Kosovo is trying to enforce its law that the euro is the national currency, and the Serbs don't like that because they've put dinars into the Serbian communities. So the question there is, are Serbia and Kosovo willing to take a more technical path towards a solution to that problem? I can think of 1,000 solutions to that problem. Or are they going to reinterpret that again as a sovereignty question? And the only way of finding out is to try, and that's what's really going on at the moment. But you ended by saying...
By asking for a single recommendation for the West,
Yeah.
to do, or how to deal with Serbia.
I think if both the EU and the Americans instructed their ambassadors in Belgrade and the UK to go tell Vučić that the era of appeasement is over, that he's got If he wants to come west, he's got to show it with concrete steps, breaking the relations with China and Russia that he's built up, these strategic partnerships. I think if, Vucic's policy is basically one of straddling, of hedging. If you move the Western position away from his straddle, he has to choose. And I think that's what we should try to do, make him choose. By the way, I wanted to take issue with something Luke said, so I'll exploit the moment.
Please.
Because I'm thinking about his proposal for a presidential visit to the region. And I'm saying to myself, how would Jim O'Brien like that idea? And I haven't talked to Jim about it, obviously, but I know how I would feel about it. I would go through the capitals and ask, where should the president go? He can't go to Sarajevo. That would be absurd. He can't go to North Macedonia. That's worse right now with a pro-Russian government. He can't go to Montenegro because it has a pro-Russian government too, no matter what the president says here. We've already beefed up our relations with Eddie Rama so much that it's ridiculous. We wouldn't want to do more of that. Serbia would love a visit by the President of the United States. They ask everybody about it. I can tell you, they've asked me about it many, many times. It would be absolutely foolhardy under current conditions to send the President to Belgrade, and you know damn well he's not going to Pristina.
Isn't that a perfect summation of the last 3 years?
Yeah.
I mean,
it shows the failure of
3 years ago,
American
he could have gone to
policy.
Montenegro, he could have gone to Macedonia, could have gone to Kosovo, could have gone to Bosnia. Can always go to Albania, right? I mean, Belgrade is where it was 3 years ago.
Look, I would say the U.S. president can go to any NATO member, regardless of how difficult the bilateral relationship or the incumbent government might be, and I think it would go a long way if there was a high-level visit to the region. It could be to a NATO member in the region. Perhaps it wouldn't be the easiest visit, but
He can go any place he wants. The question is, does it send the kind of diplomatic signal we want to send to any of these governments? And I think the answer is no. He can go to Warsaw. That's a good idea.
Well, he can go to Baltics instead of the Balkans.
yeah, you got it mixed up, right?
All right, so Ivana has a response to your kind question.
What to do, one answer, a very difficult decision, which is exactly what the West was doing back during the Milosevic time, trying to isolate Milosevic by investing more in the region. At the very early of the 90s, the idea with Milosevic was he's the pillar of stability, so we need to appease him if we want this war to end. A very similar thing is right now, without Serbia, there is no stability in the region. But the right answer would be, you're a sovereign country. Do you want to side with Russia and China? Go for it. You're a landlocked country. Let's see how they are going to send you goods and services, minus that railway with Hungary and China they are doing right now. But instead to invest in the region, instead to invest in democracy promotion and investments in the region, because that's going to be the only way that at some point, if Serbia wants to follow that thing. The second thing within that, you just mentioned the regime change. So there were massive protests last year that failed. And why? Because President Vučić made sure at the very, very early age of his career to destroy pro-Western opposition. What he created was a far-right lunatics And some portion of the far-right groups, we want the European Union, but under our terms, but we also like Russia and the Orthodox Church, etc. And he created fake pro-Western people, just a few of them, to deliver messages to the West. But there is no feasible pro-Western opposition. And then his messages, you see, all of them, they are ridiculous. You cannot find anyone better than me, which is exactly what Putin was doing at the very early stages of his career. So, having said that, I don't believe that as of today, a new pro-democratic opposition can just suddenly emerge. It takes time to create. And where do you start? With the information space. I'm always laughing when the Western, especially the EU politicians, claim Serbia wants the European Union. Let me tell you the ugly truth, which is, if you want a whatever they call it, partially free country that is leaning towards Russia and China to join the Western Union, that's exactly, the idea was like in the early 2000s, after Milosevic, the collapse, the first thing what you need to do is to create the informational environment for that. In the newspapers, talking great things about the European Union. How the European Union would be great, for Serbia. Instead, feel free to open today's newspapers and just tell me what you are going to see in the newspapers. So
my favorite thing in Serbian newspapers is the Orthodox aliens, the whole conspiracy theory about Orthodox aliens. Aliens who are Orthodox. It's an absurd environment.
But Rauf, you and me, we can laugh about that. I'm absolutely serious that due to the years of such a brutal propaganda and psychological aggression towards their citizens, there are a lot of young people who left the country, who will never return, and there is the amount of people who are stuck there, completely lost.
All right. One more question. Is there a quick question from the audience?
I can have another one if there's no...
Yeah, but quick one.
Yeah.
You should say quick answers as well.
Yeah. Ivan, I fully agree with you. That's on the previous part, except that the EU, we have to remember, is also Hungary.
Exactly.
On which Vucic is looking at...
as a savior.
And this brings me to what you said, that we need to closely look on what Hungary is going to do during its presidency in the EU Council. Luckily, it has not much competence. Whatever ideas they bring, it should be agreed by all the members. But do you think any shift in Hungarian-American relations in case the opposition candidate wins the presidential election here in the US? Also taking into account that Hungary is very close with China, and this is what Trump may not look like very much.
Trump wins, what happens with the region in light of Hungary? Yeah. Yeah. All right. Who wants to take that?
Well, of course, if President Trump wins, on a personal level, the relationship between the two governments will improve. I mean, in that sense, but in a practical sense, I don't know what it changes beyond rhetoric. Institutionally, I think there's, there'll be still a lot of concern in the U.S. government about what Hungary's doing or not doing in some cases. Also, I think some conservatives in Washington are slowly starting to wake up to when they see these headlines, President Xi going to Budapest, all these the security agreement with China, the Hungarian foreign minister traveling to Iran to boost economic ties. These are issues that are becoming, people are becoming more aware of. So I think there are some who are very enthusiastic about, some on the right of US politics, far right, I should say, they're questioning now, or they're starting to question or wondering, well, if Orban's this great role model of conservative ideas and values in Europe, then why is this foreign minister in Tehran trying to negotiate more trade? And I think that's a reasonable question to ask.
All right. Ivana,
just a quick note. I'm actually not very positive about that, because the way that it works is like Orban and Vučić, they have very, very strong ties, and how they operate with Russia and China has a massive impact also on the European Union, because on one side we have Hungary that is inside of the European Union, and this is the paradox. On one side, why Vučić does not want to be in the European Union, but on the other hand, Russia and China would love to have another Orban and to create a coalition of whatever you want to call, that coalition within the European Union. What we saw just with the railway, Hungary, Serbia, China, we also saw numerous similar agreements when it comes to critical issues related to Russia. And the third thing is, believe also Vučić when he says it, because he's relying on Hungary in a lot of institutions, whether within the European Union, also on a bilateral level. So he needs Orban for his support. He already stated that related to Kosovo. He stated that to Srebrenica, the United Nations General Assembly resolution, just filling the blank, or sanctions. One of the key reasons why there are no sanctions within the European Union towards certain actors in the region, it is in part because of Hungary.
Thank you, Ivana. Daniel, you have the last word, if you want it.
Well, I think with the exception of a presidential visit, I think we found the panel in broad agreement that the current policy hasn't worked and that something new is needed, probably something a bit tougher on Serbia, backed by EU and NATO forces more clearly and more decisively.
All right.
I just saw breaking news on Twitter that President Biden is going to the Balkan.
All right. Okay. Going to Belgrade, probably. All right. So thank you all very much. And I'd like to thank our audience online and people at Hudson, Richard, USCA guys. Thank you all very much. And hope to see you next year this time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.